wanted to get this video out, and this may have an echo. We have multiple Zoom calls going on today, and in the office right next to me there's a Zoom call in progress. So I'm going to jump right in. I wanted to address some things about the Canon R5 and R6 from long history with some Canon products. I'm really considering the R5. If it's the game changer that people say it is, it might be the very best camera ever made. It'll get you up out of bed, make your bed for you, prepare your breakfast, and then do your dishes for you after you're done with breakfast. But I want to see really how hard the Canon cripple hammer hit this particular camera after it's been out for a while. I have a long history with Canon that is one of the reasons why I ended up staying in the Nikon world, and currently I shoot with a Nikon full frame. What I found early on that I had great success for what I was trying to do with the Nikon digital cameras. I started with a 9500, and then based on the reviews I went to a 7900, and that was in 2005, and it did just a stellar job for what I needed it to do for shooting products and macro type close-ups. Just a wonderful camera, very clean output. The JPEGs could be processed, and just a very nice low noise camera. Well, ultimately I wore that camera out. I got to the point where the zoom lens would no longer zoom in and out. So I replaced it with a Canon SX130IS, and this is where I kind of discovered the danger of going along with what the large media outlets have to say about Canon products or other cameras. You really have to dig a lot deeper than listening to some of the initial reviews, particularly if the people are likely to be receiving compensation. And my experience with this camera was extremely disappointing. The reviews on it said it was a wonderful camera, that the print quality from it was great. Well, no, it really wasn't. People were hacking the camera, and I didn't know why when I first got it, but it didn't take long to see why. Canon marketing was advertising that you could get 10,000 photos on one compact flash card. And in those days, that good-sized compact flash card was about 4 gigabytes. And the problem is, when I went to do anything with those prints, and at the time I was printing 13 by 19 prints pretty regularly, you could see the blocky pixels. And so if you search it today under Canon SX130IS, there are people to this day that are still talking about hacking that camera. It wasn't the fact that it was a bad camera. It was 12.1 megapixels. The lens could be fairly sharp, but the biggest problem was the coarse JPEGs that the marketing folks forced on that camera. And I didn't want to hack it. I kind of decided that I would just move on down the road. That was, by the way, that camera's vintage was 2010. And so actually it was a big step back in the image quality that I got out of the 7900 that I bought in 2005. And basically, for my purposes, it was a dead-end product. It was so bad, and I will actually have some frames with the blocky JPEGs that you couldn't print any larger than, say, 8 by 10 or maybe 8 by 12. Really a poor excuse for a camera. Along the way, I had a friend that bought a 5D Mark IV. He also had a 5D Mark III, which did not have a very good sensor. The 5D Mark IV had a better sensor, except in his case it had a horrible magenta shift, and we would pull the files into Lightroom and it was just the files were unusable. And I want to thank Michael and Maven and some of the people that posted on F-Stoppers for mentioning the problem, so we found out that his camera was not a lone example. Ultimately, the camera went back to Canon, and we believed they replaced the sensor. They would never admit to the problem, but when it came back, it was definitively fixed. And that was after spending hours of going through settings and talking to technical support, which just was a big waste of both of our times. Lately, I've struggled with Pixma Pro 100. I have a color managed environment. This is a display color spider right here. On my Mac, I use a Color Monkey by X-Rite. And I've been very disappointed using the Platinum Pro papers, the ICC profiles, with the colors that I've gotten out of the printer. The grains are just abominable. And I'm using Canon ink. I've talked to Canon support, and they're basically saying, well, disregard the profiles and just bump up this setting by 20%, and that'll get you close. Well, I haven't ever had to deal with that. I come from an Epson background, and yes, Epsons have clog printhead issues, but they don't have the issues that I've had struggling with the Canon. And I typically output to labs that use Epson devices, and in Lightroom I download the profiles, softproof, and again, no color management issues. Only thing I'm using the Pixma Pro 100 now is for black and white and sepia prints, and I wish I'd never gone so heavy into the investment in inks for that platform or the expensive papers, because again, it's a Canon product that over-delivered or over-promised and under-delivered. And my friends that have had the Pro 100s have had much better success with the pigmented-based printers. But again, my particular example, and I have tried everything, both platforms, PCs and Macs, to make sure I wasn't double profiling or anything like that. I've outputted from Lightroom, the native Canon app, and Photoshop, and I've tried all the recommended settings, and again, the colors just are not vibrant. Particularly greens are just abominably bad. And I would have expected more from a dye-based printer. In theory, they have a larger gamut than the pigmented inks. So, getting back to my subject at hand, my personal experience that I wanted to talk about, I have a whole video on it, was I tried a Canon M50 and crop sensor mirrorless camera, and I wanted to get it for blogging. Almost all my other cameras, including my Canon G7X, which I should mention, will do a very good job of face tracking and even locking into eyes. I've been using Panasonics and some other cameras. This particular camera just was crippled from the get-go because you couldn't use the reciprocal rule with this camera. That's where if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you set the shutter speed to 50. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you set the shutter speed at 60 frames per second, and then you use auto ISO based on your light levels. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, a very poor autofocus performance and one of the worst sensor performances in still photography that I've ever seen. I have a D7200, which is before it was discontinued, ended up being in the same price range as an M50. Much superior sensor. I would say probably 3 stops better usable dynamic range. And I ended up returning the M50 because of the camera randomly freezing, and just underwhelming Canon experience again. And the fanboys would have you believe it's the best thing since sliced bread. So yeah, I'm looking at the R5 because it could be the next camera for me. But at this point, I'm shooting on a Sony RX100 Mark VII, and I've been very pleased so far with the video quality from this camera. I also want to mention that I've had good success with the Canon GX7. I have the original version, but a couple things. It actually has a Sony sensor, and the image quality and sensor performance was actually better on the 1-inch sensor than the APS-C sensor that was on the M50. I already mentioned the superior autofocus that I had with the G7 X compared to the M50. And also, by the way, it allowed the reciprocal rule, and it allowed the ability to use auto ISO. Finally, if you look at Gordon Lang's Camera Labs review of the new G7X, there is a problem with this where Canon overpromised and underdelivered. It's really not a 24mm lens. They stretch the image to cover the sensor at the 24mm setting. And because of that, there's a lot of wonkiness, which I'll show you in the images. And I do print large, and with the modern tools that you have with Gigapixel and Topaz Denoise AI, you can get some very nice images out of a 1-inch sensor camera. With the G7X Mark 1, 2, and 3, again, you end up with this wonkiness out towards the corners, and if you're a landscape photographer, it's almost unfixable. So I learned to just start at about 35mm equivalent instead of 24, and then just do some kind of panorama to get the more wide angle effect. But again, another example of why I don't trust Canon and why the Canon cripple hammer is real. So I'm looking at this R5 and this R6, and I know everybody's excited. I personally will get up at 6:30 tomorrow morning so I can be online at 7 a.m. But I'm going to look at this with a jaundiced eye. I want to wait till real reviewers out there that I trust, guys like Dustin Abbott and Michael the Maven, not the fanboys, actually do some hard looks at the camera. Remember, the EOS R had a banding issue that Canon finally fixed, as it was finally too obvious from good reviewers that this was a real issue. So Canon, we're watching, but I'm excited about the advancement in photography. Thank you.